The message before the guns. At 2:17 in the morning on March 26, 1941, inside a dim room at Bletchley Park, Mavis Lever was sitting over a strip of Italian naval traffic with pencil marks around letters that did not yet look like death. Outside, the English night was still under blackout. Windows were covered. Lamps were low. Somewhere in the building, a kettle had gone cold. Paper moved softly across wooden desks. A chair scraped once, then stopped. There was no gunfire here, no salt spray, no searchlights cutting across the sea. Only the dry sound of pencil on paper, the small fatigue of eyes forced to stay open, and the strange pressure of knowing that a mistake in a quiet room could travel hundreds of miles before anyone understood it. She was 19. That detail matters. Because when people imagine the Mediterranean War, they usually imagine steel. Battleships, cruisers, torpedoes sliding through dark water, aircraft lifting from Malta under a ceiling of smoke. Italian sailors running across decks as alarms rang through the hull. British destroyers turning hard at night, engines trembling below the waterline. But before some of those ships ever saw each other, before the first shell crossed the black water near Cape Matapan, there was a message. A few groups of letters. Pattern. A hint that the Italian Navy was preparing something larger than routine movement. Mavis Lever worked under Dilly Knox, one of the British codebreakers who had been attacking Italian naval systems with patience that looked almost ordinary from the outside. There was no dramatic machine shaking the room. No triumphant speech. Most of the work was slower than that. A line compared with another line. A suspected phrase. A repeated habit. A clerk's convention. A naval routine that seemed harmless to the person who used it. In war, routines are comforting. They are also dangerous. The Italian Navy believed its orders were hidden behind procedure and cipher. That belief was not foolish. Ciphers had protected armies and fleets for generations. They allowed commanders to speak across distance. They gave movement to formations that could not see each other. They turned scattered ships into a single instrument. But the same message that gave an admiral command could also give an enemy a doorway. At Bletchley Park, that doorway was opening. Across the Mediterranean, Italian ships were being prepared. Ammunition came up from magazines. Men checked machinery. The deck smelled of salt, oil, rope, paint, sweat. Officers unfolded charts under yellow light. The sea between Italy, Greece, Crete, and Egypt looked wide enough to hide a fleet. It had hidden fleets before. Rome believed the Mediterranean could still be controlled by speed, caution, escorts, reconnaissance, and naval courage. They knew the British were dangerous. They knew Alexandria held a powerful fleet. They knew Malta sat like a thorn in the middle of Axis movement. But they did not believe that a young woman in England could sit at a desk and help change where British battleships would be waiting. That was the first divide. What they believed was that secrecy lived inside the cipher. What really happened was that secrecy had already begun to leak. The message did not sink a ship by itself. Pencil mark does not kill. A decrypted phrase does not burn steel. Men still had to make decisions. Admirals still had to move. Sailors still had to fight in darkness. And the sea, as always, could ruin any plan made on land. But by that morning, the Mediterranean War had changed shape. Not visibly. That was the danger. No Italian lookout could see Bletchley Park on the horizon. No radio operator aboard an Italian cruiser could hear the small crack forming in the system. No admiral in Rome could feel the pressure of British eyes moving over Italian words. The war was still being fought with guns. But it was also being read. And the British now faced their own problem. Knowledge was not the same thing as victory. If they acted too perfectly, if their ships appeared too precisely, if the Italians understood that their messages had been opened, then the doorway would close. The code might change. The habits might disappear. The source might be lost. So the secret had to remain secret even while it was being used. That is what made the Mediterranean intelligence war so cruelly delicate. A commander could know something and still not act. Or he could act, but only after creating a visible excuse. A reconnaissance aircraft. A patrol report. Coincidence. Some explanation the enemy could believe. Because in this kind of war, The enemy must not only be defeated. He must be deceived about how he was defeated. On that March morning, the paper at Bletchley did not look like the sea. It did not smell of cordite or bunker oil. It did not carry the cries of men trapped in burning compartments. It was quiet, almost fragile. Yet somewhere beyond that paper, ships were beginning to move. And in the darkness ahead, the Italian Navy would soon discover British guns waiting where they were not supposed to be. The question was not whether the British had read enough. The question was whether they could turn a secret into an ambush without exposing the secret itself. What Rome believed the sea still hid. To understand why Italy realized the truth too late, it is important to begin with what Italy believed, and why that belief made sense. The Mediterranean was not the Atlantic. It was narrower, more crowded, more political, more immediate. A ship leaving an Italian port was not disappearing into an endless ocean. It was entering a basin ringed by airfields, islands, submarine zones, old trade routes, and naval bases. Italy sat near the center of that basin. On a map, the position looked powerful. From Sicily, Sardinia, Naples, Taranto, and the southern Italian ports, Axis forces could reach toward Libya, Greece, and the central Mediterranean. The sea looked like something that could be managed. Not easily, but managed. The Regia Marina was not a joke. Its officers were professionals. Its ships were fast and often beautifully designed. Its sailors understood danger at sea in a way no staff officer could fully reduce to a report. Italian naval crews did not sail into the Mediterranean believing themselves safe. They knew British submarines were hunting. They knew aircraft from Malta could appear without warning. They knew a convoy was a slow target moving across exposed water. But danger is not the same as exposure. Italy believed that if movements were planned carefully, if escorts were assigned, if routes were varied, if air cover arrived when promised, the sea lanes could remain open. The North African War depended on it. Men, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts, trucks, replacement engines, aircraft fuel, artillery shells. Everything had to cross water before it could matter in the desert. A tank in Libya began as cargo. A German offensive began as shipping tonnage. A squadron's next mission might depend on barrels loaded days earlier in an Italian harbor. And so the Mediterranean became a machine of movement. Ships loading at night, convoys assembling, escorts taking station, radio messages moving between ports, commands, and sea, schedules adjusted, orders amended, warnings sent, delays explained. From Rome, this was the work of war. From Bletchley Park, it was a stream of clues. The Italians knew the British were watching the sea. That was obvious. Reconnaissance aircraft flew. Submarines lurked. Malta was a fixed threat. British naval commanders had aggressive instincts and long experience. So when convoys were attacked, there were believable explanations. A Sunderland may have sighted them. A submarine may have reported them. A Malta-based aircraft may have caught a glimpse through cloud. A British commander may have guessed correctly. War gives men many ways to explain misfortune. That was part of the tragedy. The visible battlefield offered enough explanations to hide the invisible one. If a tanker burned at night, the flames did not reveal why the enemy had arrived. If a destroyer took a torpedo, the hole in the hull did not explain the intelligence chain that put the submarine near the route. If British ships appeared at the wrong hour for Italy and the right hour for Britain, it could still be called luck. And luck is a dangerous explanation because it comforts command. It allows a system to continue. Inside Italian naval offices, men studied maps with seriousness. They calculated fuel, timing, distance, escort strength, British base locations, weather, moonlight. These were real factors. They mattered. A convoy could be saved or lost by them. There were officers who understood the problem with painful clarity. There were never enough escorts, never enough aircraft at the right moment, never enough certainty. But the hidden problem was deeper. Every convoy needed communication. Every change created another message. And every message, if read by the enemy, could turn distance into exposure. What Italy believed was that the Mediterranean was a battlefield of ships, aircraft, islands, and fuel. What really happened was that it had also become a battlefield of language. At Bletchley, intercepted Italian traffic could be sorted, tested, compared, and attacked. One message alone might mean little. 10 messages might suggest a pattern. A familiar format might reveal a beginning. A repeated phrase might become a handhold. A careless routine could become an opening wide enough for warships to pass through. The Italian system did not collapse all at once. It was not a single lock suddenly opened forever. Code breaking was uneven, time-sensitive, fragile. Sometimes messages were read too late. Sometimes not at all. Sometimes intelligence arrived with gaps, doubts, and warnings. Men had to interpret it. Commanders had to risk decisions based on it. But even partial knowledge could be deadly. If the British did not know everything, they might still know enough. Enough to send aircraft. Enough to position submarines. Enough to move a surface force. Enough to tell an admiral that the enemy was not where he appeared to be, but where his messages said he must go. For Italy, the danger was not that its navy lacked courage. The danger was that courage could not protect a route already known. And soon, in the eastern Mediterranean, that difference would be measured in burning ships. The hidden problem. A war written in routine. War creates paperwork before it creates wreckage. That is one of its less dramatic truths. Before men die, orders are typed. Before a convoy sails, loading instructions are issued. Before a fleet leaves harbor, messages move through channels. Fuel requests, escort assignments, timing changes, port delays, weather reports, operational summaries. Each one seems small, necessary, harmless. But in a communications war, necessity becomes exposure. Italian officers were not fools for using radio. A modern navy could not operate without it. Ships moved across distances too large for flag signals alone. Aircraft had to be coordinated. Convoys had to be redirected. Commands had to respond to changing threats. Silence could protect a force, but silence could also paralyze it. So messages had to be sent. And the British listened. Listening was not the same as understanding. At first, intercepted traffic was noise. Groups of letters, fragments, repetitions, timings. The codebreakers had to turn noise into structure. They needed patience, suspicion, and a tolerance for uncertainty that most fighting men would have found unbearable. A sailor sees a wave. A gunner sees a target. Pilot sees cloud and tracer. But a codebreaker sees possibility inside something designed to be meaningless. Dilly Knox's section at Bletchley Park worked against Italian systems with a mixture of intellect and stubbornness. Mavis Lever and others did not sit there waiting for a machine to hand them answers. They attacked habits. They looked for cribs, expected words or phrases. They studied procedure. They guessed, tested, rejected, returned. The work had a strange intimacy. To break a system, one had to understand the people using it. Not as heroes or villains, but as operators under pressure. A tired radio man might follow routine too closely. A staff officer might use a predictable phrase. A message might begin in a form that had been seen before. In peacetime, such habits were normal. In war, they could become fatal. The Italians believed their cipher transformed meaning into secrecy. What really happened was that human behavior kept leaving fingerprints on the cipher. This is where the story becomes more subtle than a simple contest of machines. The British did not read every Italian message instantly. They did not possess a magic window into the enemy mind. There were delays, failures, misunderstandings, and false starts. Some decrypted information could not be used in time. Some was too vague. Some had to be combined with other sources. Aerial reconnaissance, traffic analysis, submarine reports, naval experience, and judgment. But when intelligence arrived early enough, it altered the shape of decision. It could turn a wide sea into a narrowing corridor. A commander who might otherwise search could instead wait. A patrol that might have swept empty water could move toward a more promising position. A reconnaissance flight could be sent not to discover the truth, but to provide a public reason for a truth already known. That last point mattered greatly. British intelligence had to remain hidden behind visible action. A decrypted message could not simply be treated as a trophy. It was a source to be protected. Every success carried a risk. If the Italians suspected their naval traffic had been compromised, they could alter procedures, change keys, tighten discipline, or replace systems. Then the window would close. So the British had to behave like men who were lucky, or observant, or aggressive, not like men who had read the enemy's orders. This created a war inside the war, not only breaking codes, but disguising the consequences of breaking them. For the Italian Navy, the hidden problem was not only technical. It was interpretive. When a convoy was attacked, the most obvious causes appeared on the surface. British aircraft, British submarines, Malta, bad weather, delayed air cover, faulty coordination, a leaked schedule somewhere in port. There were always visible suspects. But an invisible cause does not announce itself. It does not leave debris. A cipher failure does not float in the water beside a wreck. So the system kept explaining disasters in ways that were partly true, but not complete. An incomplete truth can be more dangerous than ignorance, because it leads men to fix what they can see while leaving the deeper wound open. In the spring of 1941, the British were preparing to use that wound in a major operation. The Italian fleet was about to sail into waters where British intelligence had already drawn a shadow around its movement. The officers aboard the ships could feel the vibration of engines through the deck plates. They could see the guns. They could smell oil and salt and paint. They could not see the paper trail moving ahead of them. And in naval war, what a commander cannot see may be the thing already deciding the battle. The underdogs in the huts. There is a kind of courage that looks nothing like battle. It does not run forward under fire. It does not hold a bridge or fly through flak. It does not pull a wounded man from burning metal. It sits still when the body wants sleep. It reads the same line again. It accepts that no one outside a locked world may ever understand what the work cost. Bletchley Park was filled with people whose war did not match the public image of war. Young women in cardigans, linguists, mathematicians, clerks, classicists, chess players, men with difficult manners and brilliant minds, women whose intelligence was often underestimated by the world that depended on it. They worked in huts, not command towers. They did not stand on bridge wings with binoculars. They did not receive salutes from gun crews. Yet their labor could move fleets. Mavis Lever was one of them. Later known as Mavis Beatty, she would become associated with the work that helped break into Italian naval traffic before Cape Matapan. But at the time, she was not a legend. She was young, tired, and bound by secrecy. Her work was done in pieces, under pressure, inside a system where success might be recognized only by a change in urgency around her. The men at sea had their own loneliness. The Codebreakers had another. They could not tell friends what they were doing. They could not tell family. Sometimes they could not even know the full result of their work. A decrypted message might leave the hut and vanish into higher channels. Days later, perhaps a rumor would drift back. A battle, a convoy intercepted, a naval movement disrupted, or nothing would come back at all. The silence was part of the job. That silence is important because it shaped the human side of the intelligence war. These were not people playing puzzles while others fought. They knew that behind the letters were ships, crews, and consequences. They knew that if they were right, British forces might move. They knew that if they were wrong, men could be sent into danger. And they knew that if they succeeded too clearly, the enemy might discover the source and shut it forever. Their burden was not only to solve. It was to solve quietly. For Italy, these people did not exist. They were not in Italian planning assumptions. No admiral in Rome was imagining a young woman in Buckinghamshire tracing patterns in naval traffic. No destroyer captain leaving harbor thought his danger might have begun in an English hut, under a shaded lamp. That invisibility made them powerful. It also made them easy to forget. In most war stories, the underdog is a soldier with a rifle, a pilot with a damaged engine, a tank crew outnumbered in smoke. Here, the underdogs had paper cuts and headaches. They fought exhaustion. They fought uncertainty. They fought the arrogance of systems that often underestimated them. And they fought an enemy who could not be allowed to know they were fighting at all. There is a strange moral discomfort in that. A codebreaker does not see the face of the man her work may help kill. A sailor does not know the name of the person who helped place the enemy in his path. War separates cause from consequence. Intelligence separates them even more. Somewhere in the Mediterranean, an Italian radio operator might send a routine signal with the dull efficiency of a man doing his job. Somewhere in England, that signal might be intercepted, passed, sorted, studied. Somewhere else, an admiral might receive intelligence that changed his course. Days later, shells might land in the dark. No one in that chain saw the whole chain. That is why this story must be told carefully. British codebreakers did not win the Mediterranean alone. Sailors, pilots, submariners, mechanics, dock workers, radar operators, and commanders all mattered. The sea still demanded courage. Guns still had to fire. Aircraft still had to find targets in weather and darkness. Convoys still had escorts fighting back. But intelligence changed the odds. And sometimes changing the odds is enough. The Italians believed war at sea belonged mainly to those who sailed. What really happened was that the Mediterranean was also being shaped by people who never saw it. In the huts at Bletchley, the underdogs were learning that the quietest room in a war could still be a battlefield. But knowing the enemy's movement was only the beginning. The next problem was more dangerous. How to act on that knowledge without making the enemy understand that his secrets had been opened. And that required deception. Not against the Italians alone. Against the very appearance of truth. The forbidden advantage. An intelligence secret is not like a captured gun. A gun can be fired openly. Its noise announces itself. Its purpose is obvious. If the enemy sees it, nothing mysterious has been lost. But a broken code is different. Use it carelessly and it disappears. That was the British dilemma in the Mediterranean. Once Bletchley Park began producing useful information, commanders could not simply behave as if they had been handed the enemy's diary. They had to turn secret knowledge into ordinary-looking action. They had to build cover around their own advantage. A reconnaissance aircraft might be sent over the water, not because the British needed it to find what they already suspected, but because the Italians needed to believe it had found them. A patrol might appear to stumble into contact. A commander might wait for a visible confirmation before acting. Sometimes intelligence could be used only indirectly. Sometimes men had to accept delay because the source was more valuable than a single strike. That is a hard thing to ask of fighting men. A sailor wants clarity. A pilot wants a target. An admiral wants to act before the opportunity closes. But the intelligence war demanded restraint. It forced commanders to think not only about what they knew, but about what the enemy would think they knew. The forbidden advantage was not code-breaking itself. It was the temptation to use code-breaking too perfectly. The British had to win without explaining why they were winning. This meant that every operation carried a double tension. On the surface, there was the visible battle. Ships maneuvering, aircraft searching, torpedoes running, gunners waiting for range. Beneath it was the hidden performance. Making intelligence look like luck, reconnaissance, aggression, or routine naval skill. Italy, meanwhile, was trapped by appearances. If British forces appeared after an aircraft sighting, then perhaps aircraft had found the ships. If a convoy was intercepted near a predictable route, perhaps the British had guessed. If submarines were waiting, perhaps patrol zones had simply been well chosen. The deception did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be believable enough. This is one reason delayed realization is so powerful in war. A commander does not need to misunderstand everything. He only needs to misunderstand the one cause that matters most. Italy could recognize British bravery, British aggression, Malta's importance, radar's value, and the danger of night action, and still miss the deeper pattern. Cape Matapan would become the great example. The Italian fleet moved into the eastern Mediterranean in March 1941 as part of an operation meant to challenge British movement and support Axis strategy in the region. The plan had logic. The Regia Marina wanted to act. There was pressure to do more than protect convoys. There was a political and military need to show that British control of the sea could be challenged. But British intelligence had already narrowed the uncertainty. Admiral Andrew Cunningham did not know everything. No commander ever does. But he knew enough to prepare. And he understood the importance of disguise. British movements had to appear connected to reconnaissance and normal operational judgment, not to a broken Italian naval system. So the trap formed slowly. Not with a villain's certainty. With risk. The sea might change everything. Weather might interfere. Aircraft might fail to find targets. Italian commanders might alter course. British ships might arrive too late. A decrypted message was not a guarantee. It was an opening. Still, an opening in naval war can be decisive. Imagine an Italian officer aboard a cruiser that week. He knows the British are somewhere beyond the horizon. He knows the Mediterranean is full of threats. He trusts his ship's speed, his crew, his orders, his admiral's judgment. He knows that war is dangerous, but danger is part of the profession. What he does not know is that British eyes have already reached into the operation before he has seen a British mast. That ignorance is not stupidity. It is the normal condition of men fighting inside systems larger than themselves. Most sailors do not know why a battle happens where it happens. They know alarms, orders, the angle of the deck, the smell of cordite, the sound of metal under stress. They know the face of the man beside them when the first shell lands short or too close. They do not know the quiet history of the message that helped bring the enemy there. That is why the next hours mattered so much. In British hands, intelligence would not remain paper for long. It would become movement. Cunningham's fleet would move toward contact. Aircraft would be used. Cover stories would be shaped. Decisions would be made in the space between certainty and doubt. The British had read enough to know that something was coming. Now they had to meet it in darkness. And in darkness, the Italian Navy would learn that the enemy it could see was only part of the enemy already against it. Cape Matapan, the trap in the dark. By the night of March 28, 1941, the Mediterranean had become a black surface broken by wake, smoke, and the nervous discipline of men waiting for orders. The Battle of Cape Matapan did not begin as a simple disaster. It began as an operation with purpose. Admiral Angelo Iachino led Italian naval forces into the eastern Mediterranean. The Regia Marina wanted to strike British movements, threaten convoys, and assert itself in waters where the war was becoming increasingly contested. The Italian ships were fast. Their crews were trained. Their officers understood that they were entering danger, but they were not sailing blind in the ordinary sense. They had charts. They had orders. They had confidence in speed and maneuver. What they lacked was knowledge of how much had already been known about them. On the British side, Admiral Andrew Cunningham moved with a different kind of confidence. Not perfect confidence. No commander at sea has that. But he had been given something rare, intelligence that made the enemy's intention less obscure. He could bring his fleet into position with a sharper sense of where the Italian force might be found. Still, the sea had to be crossed. And the sea has no respect for secret papers. Aircraft became part of the hunt. British torpedo bombers attacked. Italian ships maneuvered. One of the crucial moments came when the Italian battleship Vittorio Veneto was struck by a torpedo and damaged, forcing a reduction of speed and altering the shape of the operation. Later, the heavy cruiser Pola was hit and disabled. In naval war, a damaged ship is more than a casualty. It becomes a decision. Do you leave her? Do you return? Do you risk more ships to save men? For sailors, the answer is never abstract. A disabled ship is not a symbol. It is steel full of breathing men. Men with names, routines, fears, photographs, and half-finished letters. To abandon them is unthinkable until war makes it thinkable. Italian cruisers and destroyers were sent back toward Pola. That decision was human. It was also fatal. Night settled over the water. British ships approached with radar and tactical readiness that the Italians did not match. The darkness that might have protected the Italian force instead became a trap. British battleships closed to a devastating range. Then the searchlights opened. Imagine that moment from an Italian deck. 1 second, darkness. Engine vibration underfoot. Men moving with the strained quiet of night stations. The smell of oil and warm metal. A voice somewhere low and urgent. The sea black on both sides. Then white light. Hard, unnatural, merciless. A ship that had been invisible becomes exposed in an instant. The human eye struggles. Shadows vanish. Steel appears. And beyond the light, British guns are already trained. The first salvos were catastrophic. Heavy shells tore into Italian cruisers at close range. The night filled with flashes, smoke, splinters, and the sound of metal opening under force. Men ran into passageways that were already filling with smoke. Electrical systems failed. Ammunition spaces became death traps. Orders were shouted and lost beneath the violence of impact. This was not the elegant naval combat imagined on charts. It was sudden ruin. The Italian heavy cruisers Zara and Fiume, along with Pola, would be lost, and destroyers were also sunk. The human cost was terrible. Hundreds of men died in the dark water, in compartments, in fire, in the cold after abandoning ship. Others survived only to carry the memory of light appearing where the enemy should not have been. From the British perspective, the action was a victory of positioning, night fighting, radar, command, and intelligence. It was not one thing. It was the combination that mattered. Codebreaking helped bring Cunningham to the opportunity. British operational decisions turned opportunity into contact. Radar and night tactics helped turn contact into destruction. War rarely gives one cause the whole victory, but it often gives one hidden cause the power to make victory possible. For Italy, Cape Matapan was a shock that could be explained in several ways. British aircraft had damaged ships. British night fighting had been superior. Radar had mattered. Command decisions had mattered. The rescue of Pola had exposed the force. All true, but not complete. The deeper truth remained behind locked doors in Britain. Italian commanders could study the wreckage and still not see the first crack in the chain. They could mourn the dead, review tactics, argue over decisions, and still fail to grasp that the operation had been compromised before the night battle began. This is what made Matapan so haunting. The Italians did not simply lose ships. They lost them inside a battle whose hidden architecture they could not fully examine. What they believed was that they had met the British fleet through reconnaissance, chance, and tactical movement. What really happened was that part of the battle had begun when Italian signals became readable. By morning, the Mediterranean carried oil, wreckage, and men in the water. British ships moved among survivors. The sea, which had hidden so much the day before, now revealed only the aftermath. Broken wood, floating debris, a sailor's cap, the dull shine of fuel spreading on the surface. But there was one thing the sea did not reveal. It did not reveal Bletchley. And because it did not, Italy's next mistake was already waiting. The wrong explanation. After a defeat, every navy searches for reasons. That search is necessary. Men have died. Ships are gone. Commanders must explain what happened not only to history, but to themselves. Reports are written. Timelines reconstructed. Decisions defended or criticized. Technical weaknesses identified. Training failures discussed. The dead cannot speak, so the living arrange the facts around them. After Cape Matapan, Italy had facts. British aircraft had mattered. British radar and night tactics had mattered. Italian limitations in night fighting had mattered. The decision to return for the damaged Pola had mattered. The lack of comparable radar awareness had mattered. There were enough visible causes to build a full explanation. That was the problem. A visible explanation can be true and still incomplete. The Italian Navy could look at Matapan and conclude that it needed better air reconnaissance, better coordination, better night training, better radar, better caution. Those conclusions were not wrong, but they did not touch the hidden wound. The British had not merely fought well once contact was made. They had been helped in knowing where and when contact might occur. That difference is enormous. If a commander believes he was defeated after the enemy found him, he improves his battle procedure. If he understands the enemy may have known his intentions before the operation unfolded, he must question the entire communication system. He must ask who can read what, when, and how often. He must doubt routine. He must fear that the enemy is inside the decision cycle. Italy did not fully make that leap in time. partly because Britain worked hard to prevent it. The ultra-secret was protected with unusual discipline. British commanders used cover methods. Intelligence was disguised behind reconnaissance and ordinary operations. The aim was not only to beat the Italian fleet, but to leave behind a plausible story. And Matapan produced one. In many ways, the story was too plausible. The British had strong naval leadership. They had radar advantages. They had air attack. The Italians had been caught in an unfavorable night action. Why reach for a hidden explanation when visible ones were already available? That is how secrets survive. Not by making the truth impossible. By making another truth easier to accept. Inside Italian command, the consequences were painful. The Regia Marina remained brave, but more cautious. Major surface actions became more difficult to justify. The Mediterranean did not become safer. It became more psychologically complex. Ships still had to sail. Convoys still had to move. North Africa still had to be fed. And now, behind every movement, the same hidden danger remained. A naval defeat can be studied. A compromised communication system, if not recognized, continues killing. The men at sea felt the results before the staff fully understood the cause. A destroyer captain assigned to escort a convoy did not need a lecture in cryptanalysis to know that the enemy seemed to arrive with cruel timing. Merchant crews did not need secret files to know the route felt exposed. Engineers in Libya did not need to understand Bletchley Park to know fuel was short. But feeling a pattern is not the same as proving it. War generates paranoia because war generates coincidence. Sometimes the enemy really is lucky. Sometimes reconnaissance really does find you. Sometimes a submarine commander makes a good guess. Sometimes a route is predictable because geography leaves no better option. The Mediterranean was full of real threats. Malta, especially, was no illusion. British aircraft and submarines based there made Axis shipping dangerous even without code-breaking. Surface forces could strike. Minefields mattered. Weather mattered. Mechanical failures mattered. Human error mattered. This complexity helped hide the secret. Italy was not looking at a simple equation. It was looking at a storm. And inside that storm, British code-breaking was one pressure among many, but often a decisive one. The wrong explanation did not have to be foolish. It only had to be incomplete enough to allow the same vulnerability to continue. That is the heart of delayed realization. A system can learn after defeat and still not learn the right lesson. Cape Matapan warned Italy that the British could appear with deadly timing. The convoy war would make that warning more relentless. The next battlefield would not be a single night off Greece. It would stretch across months of burning tankers, scattered escorts, empty fuel stocks, and desert armies waiting for supplies that never arrived. The Italian Navy had lost cruisers. Now it would have to defend the bloodstream of an entire campaign. And British codebreakers were still listening. The convoy war, fuel, flour, ammunition, men. The North African campaign was often described in terms of movement. Advances across desert, retreats back toward Libya, armored columns appearing over ridgelines, dust rising behind trucks, tanks halted under a white sun, commanders speaking of initiative, speed, and boldness. But beneath all of that movement was a slower truth. Everything had to be carried. Fuel had to cross the sea. Ammunition had to cross the sea. Food, water containers, tires, engines, medical supplies, radios, spare tracks, aircraft parts, replacement men. All of it had to cross from Europe to North Africa before it could become battlefield power. A desert army is not only an army. It is an appetite. And the Axis appetite in North Africa was fed through Italian ports, Italian ships, and Italian escorts. That made the convoy war one of the decisive struggles of the Mediterranean. Not always dramatic in a single moment. Not always remembered like El Alamein or Tobruk. But relentless. A merchant ship leaving Naples or Taranto carried more than cargo. Carried time. Carried possibility. It carried the next offensive or the failure of one. On the docks, men worked under urgency. Crates swung from cranes. Fuel drums rolled. Engines coughed. Officers checked manifests. Sailors looked at the sky. Everyone knew Malta was waiting somewhere beyond the route. Everyone knew British submarines could be out there. Everyone knew a convoy could vanish between one report and the next. But again, they believed the danger came from what could find them physically. Aircraft, submarines, surface ships. What they did not fully see was that British intelligence could shorten the hunt. A sea search is difficult. Even in the confined Mediterranean, water is large, weather changes, and ships are small. Aircraft have limited range. Submarines cannot be everywhere. Surface strike forces must risk themselves. To attack a convoy, the British needed more than anger. They needed position, timing, and opportunity. Codebreaking helped supply those things. Not always, not perfectly, but often enough to matter. British attacks on Axis shipping combined many sources: Malta-based reconnaissance, submarines, air patrols, radar, human judgment, and decrypted traffic when available. The intelligence picture was assembled like a damaged mosaic. One piece alone might not show much. Together, enough pieces could reveal the movement of a convoy. For the Italian sailors, the experience was more immediate. A merchant ship did not feel like a strategic node when bombs began falling. It felt like a steel box full of fire risk. The men aboard knew the cargo could kill them. Fuel tankers were especially feared. A hit could turn a ship into a torch. Ammunition ships carried their own nightmare. Even ordinary cargo could trap men below decks as water rose or smoke filled compartments. Escort crews lived with a different pressure. Their task was to protect ships slower and more vulnerable than themselves. They had to watch the sky, the sea, the horizon, and the instruments. A torpedo track might appear as a white line too late. Aircraft could come in low. At night, sound itself became threatening. An engine note, a distant explosion, the sudden hammering of anti-aircraft guns. The British crews attacking them were not safe either. A pilot from Malta lifting off over a battered airfield knew the island itself was under siege. Ground crews patched aircraft with whatever they had. Men slept badly. Bombing raids tore up runways. Dust and smoke sat in the air. A submarine crew hunting convoys lived in cramped metal, listening for destroyer propellers overhead. Surface forces from Malta could strike, but they could also hit mines, lose ships, and be hunted in return. Intelligence did not remove risk, concentrated it. When it worked, British forces could appear at the point where risk promised reward. A convoy might be located not after days of blind searching, but after signals had narrowed the question. A route could be anticipated. A departure could be suspected. Cargo priority might be inferred. The Mediterranean, still vast to the men on the water, became more legible to those assembling the intelligence picture. What Italy believed was that convoys were protected by escorts, timing, and discipline. What really happened was that a convoy's danger sometimes began before it left port. And in North Africa, every loss multiplied. A tanker sunk at sea did not merely remove fuel from a ledger. It stopped engines later. It limited air missions. It forced commanders to choose which units moved and which waited. It made offensive plans brittle. Turned distance into punishment. Rommel's armies could be bold. German and Italian troops in the desert could fight hard. Mechanics could keep battered machines alive with skill and improvisation. Drivers could push trucks across brutal roads. But no courage could create fuel out of sand. The convoy war exposed the cruel mathematics of modern war. A ship sunk in the Mediterranean could be felt weeks later by a soldier staring at an empty supply dump. A decrypted message in England could echo in a desert engine that never started. And the more the British learned to connect paper to position, the more the Axis supply chain became a line of men walking under unseen eyes. But to understand why this mattered so much, the story must slow down even further. Not to admire the numbers, to see what the numbers did to survival. The mathematics of survival. There is a coldness to logistics that can make it seem bloodless. Tonnage, mileage, fuel consumption, escort strength, sailing dates, loss percentages, port capacity, turnaround time. But every number in war eventually becomes a human condition. A shortage of fuel becomes a tank crew ordered to stay still. A delayed convoy becomes a field hospital waiting for supplies. A sunk ammunition ship becomes an artillery battery counting shells before firing. A destroyed truck becomes food that cannot reach men already thirsty and exhausted. The Mediterranean supply war was full of these conversions. The Axis could send supplies to North Africa, but sending was not the same as delivering. Delivering to a port was not the same as reaching the front. Reaching the front was not the same as arriving in usable condition, at the right time in the right quantity. Every stage consumed time, fuel, labor, and luck. Tripoli was far from many frontline areas. Benghazi was closer to eastern operations but more vulnerable depending on the campaign situation. Ports could be bombed. Roads were long. Trucks wore down. Fuel used to transport fuel became part of the calculation. Desert logistics ate itself if stretched too far. This is what made intelligence so powerful. A convoy did not need to be completely destroyed to become a strategic failure. A few ships lost could matter if they carried the right cargo. A delay could matter if an offensive depended on timing. The sinking of tankers could have effects far beyond the number of hulls. The loss of spare parts could ground aircraft even when pilots survived. The loss of trucks could trap supplies at ports. In a war of machines, small interruptions could become large paralysis. The British did not have unlimited forces either. That is why information mattered. Malta-based aircraft, submarines, and surface ships were valuable but finite. They had fuel, maintenance problems, weather limits, and enemy opposition. Intelligence allowed scarce striking power to be used with greater precision. It did not make the sea safe for Britain. It made British risk more purposeful. Think of it from the viewpoint of a British operations officer. On the table, a map of the central Mediterranean, with lines from Italy to Libya. Reports come in fragments. A convoy may sail. A port has been active. Signals traffic has increased. An aircraft sighting confirms part of the picture. A submarine report suggests movement. A decrypt, if available in time, sharpens the possibility. He does not see destiny. He sees a chance. That chance must be turned into orders before it expires. Now think of the Italian convoy officer. He has his own numbers. Speed, formation, escort fuel, time of departure, expected air cover, threat zones, estimated arrival. He may know the convoy cannot be perfectly protected. He may know the cargo is urgently needed. He may know that postponement has costs too. War rarely offers a safe option. It offers bad choices arranged by urgency. He sails because the front needs what he carries. And perhaps, before he even leaves, someone else has read enough to begin hunting him. This is where the mathematics of survival becomes almost unbearable. The men aboard ship may do everything properly and still be found. The escort may fight hard and still lose the tanker. The tanker may burn for reasons that began not with a lookout failure, but with a message sent days earlier. According to post-war accounts and naval histories, the North African Traffic War imposed heavy losses on Axis shipping. Exact numbers vary by period and category, and any precise figure should be checked carefully against the specific months being discussed. But the larger pattern is clear. The struggle over convoys became central to the fate of Axis forces in North Africa. Verify. Insert month-by-month Axis shipping loss figures for 1941 to 42 if using final production graphics. What matters is not only the number. What matters is what the number reveals. A lost ship is a hole in time, cannot be replaced quickly. A trained crew cannot be recreated overnight. Cargo cannot be wished back from the seabed. A tanker sunk in November may shape a battle in December. A convoy mauled in the central Mediterranean may appear later as hesitation in the desert. And for Italy, this was a cruel burden. Italian sailors were being asked to sustain a war whose strategic demands often exceeded the resources available. They had to escort, defend, improvise, and sail again into waters where the British were growing better at turning information into attack. What they believed was that survival depended mainly on seamanship, escorts, and courage. What really happened was that survival increasingly depended on whether the enemy already knew where to look. A man can fight an aircraft he sees. He can turn toward a torpedo wake. He can man a gun. But he cannot shoot down a decrypted message. He cannot hear the pencil moving in England. He cannot know that his convoy has become not just a target, but an answer to a question the enemy has already asked. That is why the Mediterranean War must be understood not as a series of isolated attacks, but as a chain. Paper to order, order to movement, movement to contact, contact to fire, fire to shortage, shortage to defeat. And at every link in that chain, men paid the price. Men who never knew the chain existed. The men who paid for a secret they never knew. A merchant sailor does not usually die in the language of strategy. He dies in heat, smoke, water, and noise. He dies trying to reach a ladder that has bent out of shape. He dies behind a jammed hatch. He dies with fuel burning on the surface around him. Or he survives, and for years afterward, a certain smell, oil, wet rope, hot metal, brings back a night he cannot fully explain. The men who sailed the Italian convoys were not abstractions. Many were civilians or merchant marine crews drawn into a military supply system that became one of the most dangerous jobs in the Mediterranean. They carried fuel, ammunition, food, vehicles, and men. They sailed knowing the route could kill them. They did not know Bletchley Park. They did not know Mavis Lever. They did not know which of their messages had been intercepted, which had been read, which had arrived too late to matter, and which might have placed danger closer to their course. That ignorance did not make their death smaller. It makes them harder to think about, because intelligence war creates distance between decision and suffering. The person who breaks a message may never see the ship. The admiral who receives intelligence may never see the burned hands of a survivor. The pilot who attacks may see only a target through smoke and motion. The man aboard the target sees the world ending around him. On the British side, there was no clean safety either. A pilot from Malta might take off from a runway patched after bombing, climb into a sky where enemy fighters or flak waited, and fly toward a convoy whose location had been refined by intelligence but not made harmless by it. He still had to find the ships. He still had to attack through fire. He still had to return to an island that itself was starving. A submarine crew might spend hours listening in darkness, knowing that one attack could bring destroyers overhead. Depth charges did not care whether the target had been found through code breaking or chance. The pressure wave was the same. The lights flickered the same. Men held their breath the same. Surface crews striking from Malta faced mines, aircraft, and the possibility of being hunted on the return. Intelligence could point them toward opportunity, but opportunity in war is often surrounded by danger. So the human cost belongs to both sides. British intelligence saved Allied lives. It also helped send fire onto Axis ships. Italian sailors died without knowing the hidden source of some of the danger they faced. British crews died carrying out attacks made possible or sharpened by intelligence. Malta suffered under bombing. North African soldiers waited for supplies that did not come. Civilians and families received telegrams written in official language that could not contain the truth of the death. War is not made cleaner by being clever. Sometimes cleverness only makes destruction more efficient. That does not make intelligence immoral by itself. In war, every side seeks advantage. Reading an enemy's messages can shorten campaigns, prevent attacks, protect convoys, and save lives. But a serious documentary cannot treat it as a puzzle solved on a board. The solution had consequences measured in bodies. At Cape Matapan, men drowned or burned in the night. In the convoy war, men vanished in smaller actions that rarely became famous. A tanker lost here. A freighter sunk there. A destroyer damaged while trying to protect ships that could not maneuver quickly. A sailor pulled from the sea with oil in his lungs. A young officer writing names for a report while the deck still smelled of smoke. For the Italian command, every loss created pressure. For the German command in North Africa, every shortage created anger. For the men at the front, every missing convoy became hunger, immobility, vulnerability. For British planners, every successful attack confirmed that intelligence could be turned into material effect. And for the codebreakers, their work remained locked away. There is no simple emotional answer to what they felt. Some later accounts suggest moments of satisfaction when success was confirmed. There must also have been weight. They knew enough to understand the stakes, but often not enough to see the full human scene. Secrecy protected the work, but it also isolated the worker from the ordinary rituals of recognition and mourning. A soldier can point to a battlefield. A codebreaker often had only silence. That silence followed many of them after the war. They could not explain what they had done. Families knew only fragments. The public remembered admirals, battleships, campaigns, and turning points. The paper war remained hidden in sealed files and private memory. Italy believed its sailors were fighting the British fleet, Malta, submarines, aircraft, and the sea. What really happened was that they were also fighting a secret intelligence system they could not name. And the people inside that system were also trapped by it. Because when recognition finally came, it came quietly, late, and behind doors that had been locked for years. Recognition behind locked doors. After Cape Matapan, Admiral Cunningham understood that something remarkable had happened before the battle ever reached the water. The victory was not only his. It belonged to the sailors who fought, the aircrews who attacked, the radar operators, the signalmen, the officers who took risks at sea. But it also belonged to people who had not smelled salt air during the action, people who had spent the crucial hours over paper. Cunningham's reported visit to Bletchley Park after the battle carries a quiet power because it breaks the usual silence for a moment. An admiral, a man of the visible war, came to thank those in the hidden one. For codebreakers accustomed to secrecy, that kind of acknowledgement mattered. It told them that the letters, the guesses, the fatigue, the pressure had reached the sea. But the door closed again. The broader story remained secret. Ultra-intelligence could not be publicly discussed. The systems, methods, and successes of wartime codebreaking stayed concealed for decades. Many who had worked at Bletchley returned to ordinary life carrying an extraordinary silence. They had been present at one of the most important hidden fronts of the war, but they could not claim it. That delay shaped historical memory. For years, battles were described largely through what could be seen. Forces, commanders, weapons, tactics, geography. Cape Matapan could be explained by British night fighting and Italian vulnerability. The convoy war could be explained by Malta, submarines, air power, and naval pressure. All of that was real. But without the intelligence layer, the pattern was incomplete. The Mediterranean looked like a war of ships and islands. It was also a war of messages. Delayed recognition does not only affect individuals. It affects how societies understand cause and consequence. If the hidden factor remains hidden, people may overemphasize visible heroism and underestimate invisible labor. They may imagine that battles were decided only by firepower, when sometimes they were shaped by a clerk's habit, a radio procedure, a repeated phrase, or a young woman's refusal to let a pattern go. That does not diminish the sailors. Completes the picture. The men at sea still had to fight. A decrypted message did not steer a battleship through darkness. It did not load guns. It did not keep a damaged ship afloat. It did not fly a torpedo bomber into anti-aircraft fire. But it could bring those actions into the right place at the right time. Timing is one of war's most unforgiving elements. Too early, and the enemy is not there. Too late, and the chance is gone. The British intelligence system helped compress uncertainty. It gave commanders better timing. And in the Mediterranean, timing could decide whether a convoy arrived, whether a fleet was intercepted, whether a desert army moved or waited. For Italy, recognition of the threat came too slowly and too incompletely. They knew British intelligence was capable. They knew communications security mattered. But the full extent of what had been read, when and with what effect was not clear in the moment. By the time the hidden war could be properly reconstructed, many of the men who paid for it were gone. There is a sadness in that. Not because Italy was innocent of war, but because ordinary men often suffer most from failures they did not create and secrets they could not know. The codebreakers, too, lived under a strange delayed existence. Their work mattered intensely when it was done, then disappeared from public view. Only later did the names return. Mavis Lever, Dilly Knox, the teams in the huts, the intercept stations, the analysts who turned fragments into usable intelligence. They were not superheroes. That would be the wrong way to remember them. They were people working inside pressure with limited sleep, imperfect information, and the knowledge that being wrong could cost lives. Their strength was not theatrical. It was disciplined attention. And perhaps that is why their story fits the Mediterranean War so well. Because the entire campaign turned on things that were easy to overlook until they failed. Fuel, timing, signals, ports, escorts, maintenance, ordinary labor. The visible war made headlines. The hidden war made openings. And after the files began to open, after the silence began to lift, the Mediterranean campaign looked different. Not completely different. The ships were still there. The battles still happened. The dead were still dead. But the structure beneath the events became clearer. Italy had not only been outgunned in certain moments. It had been read. The question left for us is not whether code-breaking mattered. It is how many moments of the war we still misunderstand when we look only at the smoke. What they believed. What really happened. Return for a moment to the room at Bletchley Park. Not the whole building. Not the myth. Just the room. A lamp. A desk. A young woman leaning over Italian naval traffic. Pencil marks. Cold tea. Paper that looks too thin to carry the weight of ships. Outside, England under blackout. Far away, the Mediterranean waiting in darkness. That is where the story began. Not because the codebreakers were the only people who mattered, but because their work reveals something essential about modern war. The decisive point is not always where the explosion happens. Sometimes it is earlier, quieter, almost invisible. Italy believed the Mediterranean could still hide movement if ships moved carefully, if escorts did their duty, if routes were guarded, if commanders balanced speed and caution. That belief was not absurd. It came from naval experience. It came from geography. It came from the hard reality that every convoy had to sail, no matter how dangerous the route became. British codebreakers did not erase that reality. They entered it. They turned messages into warning. Warning into movement, movement into contact, contact into fire, and fire into shortages felt far away in the desert. At Cape Matapan, the result was sudden and violent. Searchlights, heavy guns, cruisers dying in darkness. In the convoy war, the result was slower but perhaps even more decisive. Tankers lost, cargo delayed, supply chains strained, armies waiting for what the sea had taken. The men who lived through it often saw only their piece. An Italian sailor saw the flare of an explosion and the black shape of water below. A British pilot saw a ship through smoke and tracer. A submarine commander heard destroyer screws overhead. A staff officer saw a line on a map. A codebreaker saw letters become meaning, then watched the meaning disappear into secrecy. No one saw the whole war. That is why history has to return to these stories carefully. Not to turn intelligence into magic. Not to pretend codebreaking alone won battles. Not to reduce the courage of sailors to a footnote in a cipher room. The truth is more serious than that. The Mediterranean War was won and lost through combinations. Steel and paper. Fuel and mathematics. Courage and routine. Human error and human patience. Visible violence and invisible knowledge. The Regia Marina fought with skill and sacrifice, but it often fought inside a hidden disadvantage it could not fully measure. British commanders still had to risk ships and men, but they were sometimes guided by knowledge Italy believed was secure. The result was not a clean story of brilliance against blindness. It was a war of limits, pressure, and delayed understanding. And that delay mattered, because in war, realizing the truth after the ship has sailed is often the same as not realizing it at all. By the time Italy could understand how deeply the Mediterranean had been read, too many convoys had burned, too many sailors had vanished, too many desert plans had collapsed under shortages that began at sea. The paper in that room at Bletchley did not look powerful. But power in war does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet line of text, a repeated phrase, pattern noticed before dawn. They believed the Mediterranean still hid their movements. But what really happened was colder and more dangerous. The sea was being read before it was crossed. And in war, the truth that arrives too late is not a lesson. It is a verdict. If you are watching from a place touched by this history, Tell us where you are in the comments. And if someone in your family served at sea, in the air, in the desert, or in any forgotten corner of the war, you are welcome to share their story below. At WW2 Warfront, we follow the moments where belief met reality, and where ordinary people carried the weight of decisions made far above them. Subscribe to continue hearing the World War II stories that were hidden behind the headlines, behind the maps, and sometimes behind locked doors.